Some men forget promises because time wears them down. Eddie Cole forgot mine because he thought I was too old to do anything about it. The cold air bit at my cheeks as I stepped off the curb, eyes fixed on the glass front building across the street. 40 years ago, this was a dusty machine shop with a leaky roof and oil stains deep enough to tell the story of every car that rolled in. Now it gleamed like a monument, the words Coalworks Innovations in sleek silver letters stretching across the front. The street lamps lit the polished stone steps leading to double glass doors, where guests in tailored coats shook hands with the doorman and handed over invitations like boarding passes to a better life. I didn't belong there. Not tonight. Not on their guest list. But I had come anyway. Once, Eddie and I were more than friends. We were partners. Back in the late 70s, when the factories started closing and the town's heartbeat slowed, we built something together. Not much at first, just a battered van, a set of tools, and a dream to bring repairs to small towns, forgotten by the big guys. It was my design, my idea, the way the routes would work, the profit shared evenly among techs, the van outfitted for efficiency. Eddie believed in it, or at least, that's what I thought. We called it Shop on Wheels. 18 months later, Eddie called it his, slapped a new name on it, trademarked it, and shut me out like I'd never been there. The day I found out was the day I stopped answering his calls. And yet, here I was, on the night of his grand 40-year anniversary celebration, standing in the shadow of a streetlight with an envelope in my pocket that could end it all. Inside, the lobby glowed warm, the hum of a string quartet mixing with the low murmur of polite laughter. I stepped in quietly, keeping to the edge of the crowd. No one noticed me, just an older man in a plain coat among people dressed for champagne and speeches. On the far side of the room, Eddie stood on a small stage, tuxedo sharp, smile polished. The years had been kind to him, too kind. Prosperity had rounded his face, softened the hands that once turned wrenches alongside mine. He started telling his origin story, the same one he'd told 100 times before. We began with nothing but grit, he said, and a vision to bring something new to our communities. The crowd clapped at all the right moments, smiling like they were hearing it for the first time. On the big screen behind him, old photographs flashed. Eddie at 20, leaning against a dented van, Eddie cutting the ribbon at his first location. In one photo, barely cropped in the corner, was a younger me head down working on an engine. No name, no credit, just a shadow in someone else's story. Most people would have walked away years ago. But some promises, the kind broken with a handshake, sit in your chest like a stone until you decide to throw it. When Eddie stepped off the stage, making his way through the crowd, our eyes met for the first time in decades. His grin widened in recognition. "Walt, you old son of a gun," he said, pulling me into a quick hug that felt more for the audience than for me. "Where have you been hiding?" "In the places where the work still smells like grease," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He laughed, but his eyes flickered, just for a second. "You should have come by sooner. We could have used a man like you on the board. Advisory role, you know, keep you busy." Busy. As if I were some retired hobbyist looking for a way to kill time. "I prefer work where the wrenches still matter," I said, holding his gaze. He didn't press it, just gave me that same smirk he'd worn 40 years ago when he told me the company wasn't big enough for 2 owners. Then someone else called his name, and he was gone, shaking hands, posing for pictures, collecting praise that didn't belong entirely to him. I slipped out quietly, the letter still in my pocket. Outside, The winter wind cut through my coat, but it wasn't the cold that made my hands tighten on the envelope. Eddie thought the night was his victory lap. He didn't know it was the start of mine. The drive back to my side of town took me past streets I hadn't walked in years. Storefronts I remembered as hardware shops and diners were now boutiques and coffee houses with names that sounded like perfume. The old movie theater was gone, just a flat lot now, waiting for some developer's idea of progress. I pulled into my driveway, the tires crunching over the same gravel I'd put down 15 years ago. My house wasn't much to look at from the outside, paint peeling, porch steps groaning, but inside, it was mine. Every nail, every corner held a memory that hadn't been stolen. I hung my coat, sat at the kitchen table, and took the envelope from my pocket. Inside was a neatly folded letter on crisp white stationery, stamped with the logo of a regional bank Eddie had borrowed from 2 years ago. The kind of loan that sounds like opportunity when you sign for it, but turns into a chain if you're not careful. I'd gotten my hands on it through an old contact, someone who owed me a favor from a time I never talk about. The letter spelled it out in precise, cold language: missed payments, a looming deadline, and a cross-default clause that could make every cent Eddie owed come due at once. I didn't smile when I read it. This wasn't about gloating, this was about setting the record straight. Back in the day, Eddie and I had a deal, unwritten, sealed with a handshake over a coffee counter in Murphy's Diner. We'd split everything down the middle. My ideas, his marketing charm. My tools, his connections. We'd even agreed on how we'd treat the guys we hired: fair pay, decent hours, no shortcuts. For a while we kept that promise. But money changes the temperature in a room. When the contracts started rolling in, Eddie's voice got smoother, and his eyes stopped meeting mine when we talked about numbers. I ignored the signs, told myself friendship was worth more than a bigger cut. Then one morning, the office door was locked, my key didn't work, and the accountant wouldn't look me in the face. Some betrayals you see coming, others hit you so clean you don't even feel the knife until years later. I folded the letter back into its envelope and slid it into the top drawer of my desk. The wood was worn smooth from years of leaning on it, thinking through problems. Tonight was no different. I wasn't going to rush this. Eddie had built his empire on the idea that speed was everything. Get there first, lock the deal, take the credit. But I'd learned something in the years since: the slower you turn the wrench, the less likely you are to strip the bolt. There were still steps to take, quiet calls to make, pieces to move into place so that when the moment came, it would feel to Eddie like the ground had shifted on its own. I poured myself a cup of coffee, black and strong, and stood by the kitchen window, looking out at the bare trees swaying in the wind. The night was still, except for the occasional hum of a car passing on the highway. Somewhere out there, Eddie was probably shaking another hand, telling another story with my fingerprints all over it. He thought the past was dead weight. I was about to show him it could pull a man under faster than he ever imagined. The next morning broke grey and cold, the kind of winter day that made the town's colors dull. I woke before sunrise, not from habit, but from purpose. On my desk, the envelope waited. I didn't touch it. Instead, I picked up the small leather-bound notebook I kept for jobs that weren't exactly public. Names, dates, details, little threads that, when pulled, unraveled bigger things. Eddie's name had its own page, written in block letters at the top. Below it, a list of people still in his orbit: suppliers, contractors, old employees who'd stayed loyal for reasons I couldn't guess. One name in particular caught my eye: Frank Daly. Back in the day, Frank was our go-to for parts when supply chains ran slow. Fair prices, no questions asked. Eddie had burned him on a big order about 10 years ago. I wondered if Frank still carried that grudge. I dialed the number from my notes. Daily Auto Parts came a voice that hadn't aged much, still gravelly from years of cigarette smoke. "Frank, Walt here," I said. "Been a while." A pause. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought you were dead." "Not yet," I said with a small laugh. "Listen, I'm calling about Eddie Cole. Some men will forgive a debt. Others will wait a lifetime for the right moment to collect." Turns out Frank hadn't forgotten. In fact, he was still sore about a shipment Eddie had promised but never paid for. 40 grand's worth of specialty parts that ended up with one of Eddie's competitors. "I can't touch him outright," Frank said. "Too many contracts tying my hands. But if he's got another order coming, maybe it doesn't show up on time. Maybe it costs him. That's all I need," I replied. We talked for another 10 minutes, enough to set the stage without making it obvious. By the time I hung up, the coffee in my cup had gone cold, but the heat in my chest hadn't faded. That afternoon, I drove past Coalworks' main facility. From the road I could see the loading docks, a line of trucks waiting to unload. I didn't stop, didn't even slow down. Just let the image burn itself into my memory. The perfect flow of a machine Eddie thought was untouchable. Machines break, always, and they never see it coming. The first turn of the wrench is always the quietest. It's the one that makes the rest inevitable. By the time Friday rolled around, the town was crawling with the kind of winter that made you feel older just walking through it. The cold seeped into bones, made every step deliberate. I pulled my coat tighter as I crossed the diner parking lot, the bell above Murphy's diner door greeting me with a familiar jingle. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and bacon grease, unchanged for decades. Same cracked red leather booths, same counter lined with men in work jackets, same waitress, Doris, who'd been pouring coffee here since Nixon was in office. "You're early, Walt," she said, sliding a mug in front of me before I even sat down. "Couldn't sleep," I told her. "Got some old business on my mind." She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask. "Around here, you didn't press for details unless you wanted to hear the whole storm." I stirred cream into my coffee, letting the hum of conversation settle around me. At the far end of the counter, Frank Daly was already halfway through a plate of eggs, his cap pushed back on his head. He caught my eye, then nodded toward the empty stool beside him. "You hear from your guy yet?" I asked once I sat down. Frank smirked. "Oh, I heard. And so will Eddie, just not the way he likes." Eddie had a shipment due, specialty engine components for one of his high-profile municipal contracts. Without them, deadlines would slip, and city inspectors would start breathing down his neck. Frank had arranged for the parts to get delayed somewhere between the warehouse and Eddie's facility. Paperwork would show the order was fine, but in reality, nothing would arrive for at least 2 weeks. It wasn't enough to cripple him. Not yet. But it was the kind of inconvenience that made clients question reliability. In business, that's the first hairline fracture in trust. You don't take down a wall with one swing. You find the weak spot, then lean on it until it gives. 3 days later, I parked my truck across the street from Coalworks, pretending to be waiting for someone while I watched. 2 of Eddie's men stood near the loading dock, talking with the urgency of people trying to solve a problem fast. A clipboard was passed back and forth, heads shaking. From where I sat, I could see Eddie himself step out onto the dock, His coat collar turned up against the wind. He barked something sharp, too sharp, and the men scattered. One got on the phone pacing, while the other started rifling through a stack of papers. Eddie stayed still for a moment, staring down the empty lot where a delivery truck should have been. Even from a distance, I could tell the smile was gone. I didn't take pleasure in it. Not yet. Satisfaction was something you earned at the end, not in the first inning. That evening, I got a call from Frank. "Your boy's making noise," he said. "Word is the city's already called to ask about the delay. He'll smooth talk them, but the crack's there. He knows someone's leaning on him, just doesn't know who." "That's fine," I replied. "Let him wonder. Let him think it's bad luck. I've got time." And I did. More than Eddie realized. My plan wasn't to knock the whole structure down in a day. It was to make sure that by the time it fell, he couldn't rebuild it. That night, as I sat by the window with the lights off, watching snow fall under the street lamp, I thought about the way betrayal works. It doesn't just take something from you, it rewrites your past, makes you doubt whether the good years were ever really yours. Eddie had been doing that for decades, turning my story into his. But I still had the truth. And now, I had a way to make it matter. Eddie had just felt the first cold draft. He didn't know the real winter was still on its way. Monday crept in with a sky that looked like it had been rubbed thin, the kind of pale grey that sits low over the river and makes roofs and smokestacks seem closer than they are. I drove the long way into town, past the industrial park where the county had planted hopeful signs 15 years ago, and then stopped planting anything else. Coalworks' main building rose out of that flat land like a new courthouse, all glass angles and brushed metal, and as I passed, I could see men unloading crates that weren't the ones Eddie had been expecting. Wrong dimensions, wrong stamping, wrong timing. Somebody had found a workaround just good enough to buy a week of excuses. I didn't stop. My business wasn't on that side of the road. I rolled on to Murphy's, the only place left where the coffee tasted like the decade it was brewed in. Doris set a mug down without looking and tapped the newspaper with a fingernail. "Your friend's in it again," she said. I tilted the page. A small item, 3 columns in city fleet maintenance delayed. Contractor cites national backlog. No names, no blame, just the kind of language you use when you need a story that won't bruise anyone who's still paying for ads. I folded the paper and let it sit. I wasn't counting headlines, I was counting days. By late morning, I was at the credit union on Maple, the one that had given me my first car loan back when they still took your word and your handshake as 2 separate forms of ID. The manager, Caroline now, not the man with the flat top who used to keep peppermints in a brass bowl, walked me into a small office with a window that faced the parking lot and a ficus that had outlived 2 remodels. We spoke in the way old neighbors do when the thing they need to discuss sits under a blanket everyone can see through. "Your request," she said, sliding a folder across the desk, "isn't unusual. Asset-backed, term under 5, proceeds for acquisition. The question is timing." "Timing," I said, "is why I'm here. Not to rush you. To tell you that when the door opens, it'll open fast. If I have to wait for papers after that, I'll be standing on the sidewalk while someone else is already measuring drapes." Caroline smiled. The tight smile bankers keep for clients who won't waste their time. "I can't commit funds without collateral in place," she said, "but I can have everything else drafted and ready. If what you think might happen does happen, it will," I said, and left the rest unsaid. I wasn't asking her to take my word, I was asking her to read the weather. We signed nothing that day, and yet I left with a manila envelope that felt heavier than its paper. Inside it, term sheets without dates, blanks where numbers would go, a quiet promise that when I reached for the lever, it would be within my grasp. On my way home, I cut down the back road that runs behind the old rail spur. Long before coalworks, there was a chain-link fence and a patch of gravel where Eddie and I had parked our first van. I pulled over and killed the engine. In the winter silence, you could hear small things, the ping of a cooling muffler 2 blocks away, a train horn way downriver, the faint rasp of dry weeds scratching the fence when the wind leaned on them. It sounded like the shop used to sound at night after we turned the lights off, machines cooling, bolts settling, work finished for a while, but not forever. I sat there and waited for the past to sting. It didn't. It settled, like a good bearing after you filled it with new grease and wiped your hands clean on a rag that's seen worse. The next day, I made 2 calls I'd put off for longer than I should have. The first was to Joe Castillo, who had started as a kid sweeping our floor and stayed long enough to become the best diagnostician the county had. Joe had followed Eddie when I didn't. A man's got to keep his house warm, and I never held it against him. He met me at the park where the geese bully joggers in the spring, and the city forgets to plow after the 3rd snow. "You trying to get me fired just by sitting next to me?" he asked, dropping onto the bench with a paper cup that steamed like a chimney. "Only if you say something that gets you fired," I said. "I'm not here to make you choose." He blew across the lid and watched a truck grind up the hill. "Something's off over there," he said finally. "Not just the parts. Schedules slipping, guys shuffled to divisions they don't know, managers who learned accounting before they learned engines. The new plant lead thinks a talk spec is a suggestion." "You looking to jump?" I asked. "I'm looking not to drown," he said. Then he turned and looked at me the way a man does when he wants to show more than he's willing to speak. "You got anything real, Walt? Not a promise. Work?" "Not yet," I said. "Soon. When it's real, I'll bring you the wrench and the contract on the same day. Not before." He nodded, like that was the only answer that wouldn't have insulted us both. We watched the geese harass a teenager into giving up half a muffin. "Eddie still talk about you like a ghost," Joe said. "Story changes depending on the room. Sometimes you're a legend, sometimes you're a lesson. Makes no difference to the guys on the floor. They just want parts that fit and lifts that don't leak. Tell them to check the fittings on Bay 4, I said. That lift was old when we were young." He laughed. "Bay 4's a metaphor now. They moved the numbers to make the spreadsheet pretty." We shook hands, and I left him to his coffee and the things he'd have to do to end his shift with all his fingers. He hadn't promised me anything, which was exactly why I trusted him. The second call was to a woman named Leela Reeves, who ran the county's purchasing office with the kind of calm that makes contractors tell the truth before she asks. We'd known each other since the fairgrounds still held a car show anyone wanted to attend. I stopped by with a dozen donuts and a story about how retirement hadn't taken. "You wouldn't be here with sugar unless you needed something with salt," she said, lifting the box lid and arching an eyebrow. "I need information," I said. "Public, but easy. Has the city flagged any vendor on performance this quarter?" She typed like a pianist. "2 minor flags," she said after a minute, "and 1 warning letter drafted. If a delivery isn't confirmed by Friday, you can guess the vendor." "I can," I said. "Don't send it because a man you knew once asked. Send it because it's your job." She shut the laptop with a pleasant click. "You always were good at letting people keep their dignity while you got what you came for," she said. "Bring coffee next time." The boys in maintenance eat the donuts before the ink dries. Out in the hallway, I passed a bulletin board with a photo from 20 years ago. County mechanics lined up in matching shirts. A banner that read, "Keeping the wheels turning." Eddie and I were both in that picture, shoulders touching, the kind of smile men wear when the road still seems to go on too long to worry about where it ends. The ache came this time, quick, then gone. It wasn't grief, it was weight. The kind you feel before you lift something that can't sit where it is any longer. By Thursday, the municipal contract was behind schedule by 5 days and counting. The article in the paper had been followed by a smaller piece online, comments turned off, which told me the editor had learned how quickly a town will break itself into camps if you give it a box to shout into. I drove past Coalworks again just as a pair of inspectors in city jackets were stepping into the lobby. Eddie met them in the doorway with a smile I recognized from every time he had ever gotten what he wanted, the smile for when he didn't. He held the door, said something that made one of them look at his watch, and ushered them inside like the foyer itself could sell competence. A younger version of me would have parked and gone in to watch. The man I am now drove on. Watching a man dance isn't the same as hearing the music cut out. That night I cleared the kitchen table, laid out everything I'd collected, and gave each piece of paper a job. On the left, the bank letter with its tidy threat disguised as clarity. Beside it, Caroline's undated term sheets, a list of assets that could be pledged without me losing sleep, a map of the county with dots where the old rural bays still stood half-used because the new urban play had swallowed the budget for maintenance. On the right, names, not just Joe's but 4 others like him, steady men and women who could run circles around an MBA if you gave them a pad and a pen and a truck that would start on a February morning. I wrote availability next to each name and dated the line. When I finished, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. There's a difference. Triumph is a sound, readiness is a posture. I slept poorly. Not from doubt, but from the twitch in the hands you get when a job is close and your muscles remember what it's like to work for 12 hours and then call that a start. In the dark, I could smell the old shop, solvent and hot metal, and hear the click of a breaker tripping when a grinder took more than it was offered. I thought of Eddie at 17, hair too long for Mr. Murphy's liking, laughing with a mouthful of fries while we drew our future on a paper placemat. I let myself be sad for those boys, not because they didn't get what they wanted, but because they didn't understand what it would cost to get it. In the morning, snow feathered down so slowly you could count flakes against the window. I poured coffee and stood at the sink while the kettle steamed. Across the street, my neighbor dragged a garbage can to the curb with the grim dignity shared by men whose backs started hurting the year their first grandchild was born. The phone buzzed once on the counter and went still. I didn't reach for it. Whoever needed me could leave proof. When I finally picked it up, there were 2 voicemails. The first was from a number I didn't recognize, a clipped voice introducing himself as outside counsel for a lender, asking if I'd be available for clarifying conversation regarding common interests. The second was from Joe. "You didn't get this from me," he said, "but check the county posting board at noon. Might be something you've been expecting." At noon, there it was, notice of performance concern, vendor to provide remediation plan within 5 business days. It wasn't a hammer. It was the tap you give a chisel before you line up the real blow. I closed the browser and sat back. The house was quiet in the way winter houses are when the furnace takes a breath between cycles. In that silence, I could hear something else too, the low, unmistakable rattle a car makes when a bearing starts to go. You don't hear it right away. Road noise covers it, and you tell yourself it's the pavement. Then one day the radio's off. The street is smooth, and there it is, A whisper that says, if you don't stop and fix this, you will stop whether you plan to or not. I rinsed my cup and set it in the rack. The plan wasn't finished, but it was working, and it was working without me raising my voice or stepping into a room I hadn't been invited to in 40 years. A man can take satisfaction from many things. Tonight I took it from paper that said what it meant, and friends who didn't need to say much at all. Outside the snow kept falling, small, steady, inevitable. The week after the county's notice went up, the air around coalworks felt different, even from a distance. You could see it in the way employees came out for their breaks, shoulders hunched, eyes darting like they were scanning for someone watching. Eddie had always run a tight ship, but this wasn't discipline, this was uncertainty. And uncertainty spreads faster than bad oil in an old gearbox. I wasn't pushing for a knockout yet. This was the middle game, where you work the edges until the center starts to fold on its own. On Tuesday morning, I met with Caroline at the credit union again. She had already pulled my file without me asking, a small sign that told me the wheels were ready to turn. We're in a position to move quickly, she said. If your situation changes, she didn't need the full story. She just needed to know that when I walked in with a signature-ready deal, she could say yes without looking over her shoulder. From there I drove to the North Industrial Park, where one of Eddie's subcontractors kept their yard. The owner, Paul Sanderson, was an old hand from our early days, one of those men who'd do you a favor quietly, provided you weren't going to embarrass him later. His yard was stacked high with pallets, most covered in snow, some half-wrapped, like they'd been abandoned mid-shipment. "You still doing Eddie's overflow?" I asked after the handshake. Paul gave me a long look. Was, until he decided to squeeze the rate down to where I was paying him to haul his stuff. He moved most of it to a younger outfit, guys who don't know what wear and tear costs them until it's too late. Which means, I said, you've got free capacity. He nodded slowly, for the right job and the right handshake. I didn't lay the cards out that day, but I made sure he knew that if the right kind of business came along, I'd be calling first. His kind of reliability wasn't something you found in the classifieds anymore. By Thursday, word reached me through Joe that Eddie had called an emergency staff meeting. 2 supervisors had walked out the day before, one citing better opportunities, the other not saying a word, just handing in his badge. No replacements lined up. That was how it started. Not with dramatic firings, but with good people quietly disappearing, leaving gaps that couldn't be filled by resumes alone. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a notepad, drawing lines between names. Joe's at the top, Paul's on the side, Caroline underlined twice. It was less a plan than a map, each connection a path towards something Eddie didn't see coming. My coffee had gone cold, but I stayed there, tracing the routes over and over until I knew them without looking. Friday brought the first real snowstorm of the season. By mid-morning, the roads were layered in slush, and the plows couldn't keep up. I took a slow drive past coalworks anyway, pretending to be heading somewhere else. In the back lot, a delivery truck sat idle, lights on, driver standing by the cab with his phone in hand, no unloading, no dock crew in sight. Another delay, another crack in the wall. As I turned onto the main road, I caught my reflection in the rear-view mirror. I didn't look like a man waging a quiet war. I looked like someone on his way home from picking up groceries, and that was the point. The less anyone saw me coming, the better. The storm kept most people in that weekend, but I made 2 short visits. One to an old contact in the county maintenance department, just to drop off a set of donuts and let them talk about how frustrating their vendors had become. The other to the small hardware store where I'd opened my first business account. The owner still kept a ledger book, no computers, no cards, just handwritten trust. "Need anything?" he asked. "Not yet," I said. But soon. By Sunday night, the snow had stopped and the town was quiet under a fresh white blanket. I sat in my armchair, reading the county board's public updates on my laptop. Buried between budget votes and road repairs was a small note, vendor performance review to be held next session. That wasn't a public trial, but it was close enough to open the door I'd been waiting on. Eddie's empire was still standing, but now I was close enough to hear the strain in its beams. Monday morning opened with that brittle kind of cold that makes even the metal on street signs creak. The river was glazed over in places, and the sidewalks had that half-frozen slush that turns ankles if you don't watch your step. I pulled my coat collar up and walked the 2 blocks from the parking lot to the diner where Joe had agreed to meet before his shift. He was already in the booth, steaming mug in hand, eyes a little darker from whatever news had been circulating at Coalworks. "It's bad," he said as soon as I slid in. "Not about to close the doors bad, but bad enough people are looking at each other before they answer questions." "Staff shortage?" I asked. "Worse. The city's on their back, and Eddie's been juggling crews to cover it. The guys know. You can't move specialists into jobs they've never touched without word getting around." He leaned forward, lowering his voice, even though no one else in the diner was close enough to hear. 2 big contracts are behind schedule now, and one of them, well, it's got penalty clauses that could eat half a quarter's profit. I stirred my coffee slowly, letting the information settle in my mind like a weight finding its balance. "That's the kind of thing that doesn't stay quiet." Joe smirked. "It's already in the break room chatter. Won't be long before the customers know." After breakfast, I didn't head home. Instead, I drove out to the industrial park on the far side of town, where the county's storage depot sat. The manager, Rick Holden, had been a steady figure there since before I left Coalworks. We talked in his cramped office while he picked at a stack of paperwork that looked older than last week's snow. "You hear about the review?" he asked. "I did," I said. "Well, they're not just reviewing Coalworks, they're reviewing the whole maintenance contract setup. Could be a chance for someone new, if they can prove they've got the manpower and the gear ready." I didn't smile, but I let him see I understood. Manpower and gear, not promises. Rick shrugged. "You've been in this business long enough to know. Promises don't turn wrenches." That afternoon I stopped by the credit union again. Caroline had the draft documents on her desk, neat as a set of blueprints. She didn't say much, and she didn't have to. Everything was waiting. It was just a matter of when I'd give the nod. By midweek, the snow had started melting, leaving dirty ridges along the streets and a steady trickle into the drains. I drove by Coalworks late in the day and saw Eddie through the front window, standing with his arms crossed while a delivery crew argued with a man holding a clipboard. Whatever the dispute was, it had his full attention and his jaw tight enough to crack a tooth. That night, Joe called. "Tomorrow," he said simply. "Something's going to break. And I think you'll want to be near a phone when it does." I didn't press him for details. Some news you let arrive in its own time. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, looking over my notes, the lines between names and places starting to feel less like a plan and more like a net. One that was slowly tightening. The wind picked up outside, rattling the bare branches against the siding. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn blew, a long, low note that seemed to hang in the air long after it should have faded. The kind of sound that tells you something's on its way, and I was ready to meet it. The call came at 9:12 a.m., a clean ring that broke the winter quiet in my kitchen. I'd left the phone face down beside the coffee pot, a habit I picked up the year I decided I didn't owe anyone my attention until the kettle boiled. When I turned it over, the number was unfamiliar. Downtown Exchange, 3 digits I associated with glass lobbies and floors that echo. "Mr. Price," the voice said when I answered, "too smooth to be sales and too careful to be friendly. This is Alan Whitford with Haviland and Marks. I believe my associate left you a message last week." He said the firm name the way some men say their regiment, like the syllables carried rank. I remembered the voicemail, clarifying conversation regarding common interests. I looked at the clock, at the steam from the kettle threading through a bar of winter light, and sat down. "What can I clarify for you, Mr. Whitford?" A papery exhale. "We represent a lender of record to Coalworks. I won't belabor details, but the covenants tied to certain municipal revenues have tightened. There is, as of this morning, a formal notice of default pending. In the ordinary course, our client would move for cure, then for more aggressive remedies. But we are mindful of reputational concerns. A stabilized outcome is preferable." "Stabilized," I said, letting the words sit between us. "That sounds like you want the patient walking into rehab, not being carried." "It sounds," he replied, "like we would entertain an interested party who can demonstrate operational continuity and assume assets without drama. A stalking horse arrangement, if you will, for certain lines. Mobility services, county contracts, trucks with bolts still in them." He didn't say what I already knew. Eddie had missed the wrong payments at the wrong time, and the 5-day window that county notice opened had dovetailed with a covenant he couldn't finesse. Banks don't care for speeches, they care for calendars. "What are you asking me for, Mr. Whitford?" I said. "A quote, a promise." "We're asking," he said, careful as a man walking near ice, "whether you might be prepared to submit an indication of interest within 72 hours. Quietly. If selected, you would be given a short diligence window, days not weeks, and the opportunity to present a transitional plan to the municipality. We would require proof of financing. Letters are acceptable, cash is better." I thought of Caroline at the credit union, the undated term sheets already in a neat stack, the collateral I'd listed column by column the night before. I thought of Paul's yard with pallets under snow, Joe's steady hands, Lila's laptop clicking shut. It wasn't a surprise, it was a bell. "I can have a letter by this afternoon," I said, "and a number by tomorrow. I'll want a defined perimeter, mobility unit assets, the rural bays, the municipal service routes. I don't want your logo, your PR firm, or a marketing department that calls an oil change a holistic experience." He laughed once, not unkindly. "Understood. I'll email the description of lots we anticipate carving. If you reply, consider that the beginning of the clock." After we hung up, I stood at the sink with both hands around the mug and watched the street for a while. The mailman came early, moving with the practiced economy of someone who knows where the dogs actually bite. A boy on a bike skidded through a patch of black ice and caught himself with a boot, that awkward dance boys learn before they learn to pretend they never stumble. The light had that flat January cast that makes everything look honest. I called Caroline. "Today," I said. "We're moving today." She didn't ask why. "Come by in an hour. Bring the collateral schedule. We'll print the letter on letterhead that makes lawyers relax." At the credit union, The printer hummed and warmed the small office. Caroline read back the key line. Funds are available subject to documentation. We stand ready to close on accelerated terms, and slid the letter across for my signature. You're liquid enough to lay a deposit if they push, she said. Don't let them invent urgency that isn't on paper. I won't, I said. We shook hands like neighbors, not like parties. I slid the envelope into my coat and drove to the park by the river where the signal on my phone was clean. I answered Whitford's email with my letter and a simple sentence: my interest is in the work, not the packaging. Send me the list. His reply came back in minutes, attachments with asset numbers, addresses, a spreadsheet that smelled like haste. Trucks 1 through 7 in the mobility division, 2 lifts at a rural bay. I could have drawn from memory with my eyes shut, a cluster of service accounts that had outperformed because they were still serviced by men who believed the day ended when the last bolt held, not when the clock did. By noon, the town had already done its part. Someone sent me a photo from across the street at Coalworks, 2 men in suits leaving with briefcases, Eddie watching them from inside the glass with a face I couldn't read through the reflection. A caption I didn't need. Bankers. I put the phone face down again and let the quiet spread. In the early afternoon, Joe called. No preamble. We just got a freeze on discretionary orders. Word from above. They're moving cash to cover something. Guys are spooked. If there's a raft anywhere in the river, now's the time to say it out loud. I don't say it out loud until I can throw a rope, I said. But listen to me carefully. If somebody posts a notice in the next 2 days, you don't jump on rumor. You wait for a call from me or for a piece of paper with my name on it. You're telling me to stall. I'm telling you I won't ask a man to walk on a bridge I haven't driven. I'll call you when there's something that holds. He was quiet a beat. I'll keep the good sockets where I can find them, he said softly, and hung up. I drove to Paul's yard and found him on a forklift, easing a pallet off a flatbed with the tenderness of a man lifting a sleeping child from a car seat. He killed the engine and listened while I outlined what I couldn't say yesterday. He didn't offer pilot fish advice or ask what was in it for him. He looked out at the rows of wrapped metal and chewed the inside of his cheek. You run it like we used to? He asked. Routes that make sense, promises men can keep, pay on Fridays. Exactly that, I said. No brand seminars, no slogans in break rooms. He nodded once. You'll need a truck tomorrow if it falls apart faster than you think. I'll need 3, I said. I can make 2 happen in an hour and a half, the 3rd by morning. He tapped the forklift's roll cage with a knuckle. Don't let me look dumb in front of my own boys. I wouldn't do that to an enemy, I said. And you're not that. On the way home, sleet began to spit against the windshield, the kind that leaves sand grain dots on glass and a film on your nerves. I turned on the wipers and let the rhythm find an even swing. There's a particular measurable calm that comes when you've lined up what you can control and accepted what you can't. Most men think it's adrenaline. It's not. It's inventory. Back at the kitchen table, I drafted my indication of interest with the care I used to give to a talk sequence, 1 step at a time, each bolt to spec. I didn't posture. I didn't plead. I gave a number that was more than scrap and less than vanity, wrote 3 paragraphs about continuity and capable hands, and closed with a list of names, first names only, who would show up on day 1 with coveralls and notepads. When I hit send, the house replied with a small groan of ductwork settling, as if it had been holding its breath too. I stood and stretched my back and let the day move past me like a train across a far crossing, loud enough to know it was real, distant enough not to shake the dishes. At dusk the phone rang again. This time it wasn't Whitford. It was a number I could have dialed in my sleep from 30 years ago. "Walt," Eddie said, voice frayed at the edges, in a way I'd never heard. "You got a minute?" I didn't answer quick enough for him, so he kept talking. "You've probably heard nonsense. People love to talk when they don't know anything. We've got a hiccup. Supply chain, city deadlines, a bank that forgot how to bank. It'll pass. But I need," he stalled on the word, swallowed it, tried again. "I need a steady head to help me calm the floor. Come down tomorrow. Walk the bays with me. Remind the boys who we are." We. I looked at the table, at the pen I'd set down with the cap off, at the printout of his assets, with lot numbers marching like tiny soldiers, at the letter from Caroline that said we were real enough to move. "Tomorrow's tight," I said. "I've got my own day." He exhaled hard through his nose, an old tell he never learned to disguise. "Don't do this," he said. "Don't turn your back on your own house. You helped build it." "No," I said quietly. "I helped build a shop where the work mattered more than the story. You built the house, and now it's yours to keep standing." Silence, then the click of a man switching to the part of himself that wins auctions and arguments. "There's a place for you," he said, the velvet back. "Advisory, if that's what you want. Something with a title. It'll look right. People will stop asking questions. I'm not worried about how things look," I said. "I'm worried about whether they run." Another silence, shorter this time. He tried a laugh and gave up halfway. "You always did love the moral high ground," he said. "I'll figure it out." "I know you will," I said. "One way or another." We ended there, not with a slam, just a line going quiet. I set the phone down and watched evening lace across the street. The furnace kicked on, the radiator ticked, and somewhere a neighbor's dog barked twice, the way dogs do when they aren't sure if they heard what they heard. I didn't sleep much, not from worry, but from the knowledge that morning would bring paper with it, either the kind that closes doors or the kind that opens them. I lay in the dark and counted the seconds after the heat stopped, the peaceful hush that falls when a house has done its part and waits for the next command. When the first pale seam of light cut the kitchen wall, I already had my coat on. The coffee maker burbled like an old friend. I folded the indication letter into a plain folder and placed it beside the door. Outside, the street looked washed clean by the night's sleet, the kind of temporary purity that fools you if you don't know how quickly the plows turn snow grey. By 8, I had Whitford's reply. "Received. You are shortlisted. Prepare to attend a meeting at 11 with lender and municipal representatives. Location attached. Bring ID. Bring proof of funds. Bring your plan." 3 lines, no adjectives. The way a man invites you to cross a threshold he doesn't control. I put on my hat, slipped the folder under my arm, and locked the door behind me. The key turned with the satisfying small resistance of something machined right a long time ago and maintained since. The air had that clean taste you only get on mornings after a storm, when the world hasn't had time to make itself complicated again. Somewhere downtown, they would be setting out bottled water and setting up a thin projector in a room that smelled faintly of carpet cleaner. Eddie would be rehearsing his smile in an elevator mirror. Lawyers would be arranging papers at angles that suggested confidence. And me, well, I was going to show up with a plan that fit in a single folder and a lifetime of not needing to pretend. The conference room was colder than it needed to be and smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, the kind of neutral box where decisions get made because no one will remember the room later. A projector hummed on a rolling cart. Bottled water stood at attention in 2 neat rows. Along one wall, the lender's people, suit jackets open, yellow pads ready. Along the other 2 from the municipality, Leela's boss, a deputy director I didn't know, and the county attorney with his pen already uncapped. At the far end, alone on his side of the table, as if by instinct, sat Eddie. Whitford, silver tie, careful smile, gestured to a chair opposite him. "Mr. Price," he said, "thank you for accommodating short notice." He didn't offer to shake. The table was too wide to make it look natural. I set my plain folder down. No briefcase, no props. Just the letter from Caroline, a typed plan, and a sheet of names written in my cleanest block hand. "We'll keep this simple," Whitford said, glancing at a printed agenda that was really a formality. "Our client has issued a notice of default under Section 6.2c. Grace has expired on one covenant and will expire on another this week. The municipality has expressed interest in continuity, not disruption. We have 2 indications of interest. Yours is one. The other one, I knew without looking, was Eddie's, the internal promise that he could refinance, restructure, charm the river backward." He sat very still, hands folded, eyes fixed on a point just left of the county attorney's pad. "Mr. Price," the deputy director said, clearing his throat, "we'll want to hear your operational plan, specifically workforce continuity, equipment readiness, and how quickly you could assume the mobility routes without interruption." 3 days to stand up, I said. 2 to stabilize. Trucks 1 through 7 are on your asset list. 2 run ready, 3 need minor service, 2 need lift cylinder work before they leave a bay. I have a supplier, Sanderson, who can deliver, and 2 temporary lifts I can install in rural bays 3 and 5 within 48 hours. Payroll by Friday. Insurance binder in 24. The county attorney looked up. Workforce. 5 leads committed verbally. I said, sliding the sheet of first names toward him. Castillo on diagnostics and training, Grady on scheduling, Iverson and Chu on the western routes, McBride to anchor the city shop until we decide whether to keep it. I won't hire off rumor. If paper isn't in hand, they don't move. Eddie shifted, not enough to make a sound, just enough to tell me the names meant something. Whitford steepled his fingers. Financing. I slid Caroline's letter across, one finger resting on the line that mattered. Local credit union. Funds available subject to documentation. Deposit by end of day if terms are set. No third-party equity. No brand campaign. Cash to close and cash to run. Leela's boss, serious eyes, sleeves rolled, leaned forward. Service level agreements are strict. Miss a week and the plows don't run. What do you do when 3 trucks are down in a storm? Don't put 3 down at once, I said. Stagger preventive. Keep 1 swing unit fueled and loaded. Parts shelf stocked for what fails most often. And the men who know where the bolts actually shear, keep them in the routes they already know, until the calendar lets you move them. No one wrote that down. They didn't have to. Every person in the room who'd ever turned a wrench had just felt their shoulders relax a fraction. Eddie finally spoke. "This is madness," he said, pushing a breath through his teeth. "We're not a broken shop. We hit a timing issue with a lender who decided to get cute in an election year. You want continuity. I can give it. You hand the keys to a man who hasn't managed a payroll in 20 years, and you'll be back here in a month, explaining to the board why half the snowplows are frozen to the lot. He had the old music in his voice, the tempo he used at ribbon cuttings and groundbreakings. It worked on crowds. Rooms with attorneys are not crowds. Mr. Cole, Whitford said mildly, your cure plan presupposes a line of credit that is not presently available. Because you yanked it, Eddie shot back. Because you triggered it, Whitford said, and the smallest edge crept into the word triggered. Let's not pretend the calendar is a rumor. The deputy director held up a palm. We're not referees. Our interest is service. The county can agree to assign the contract to a successor if we are convinced they can perform. That's today's question. Eddie spread his hands. And you think a nostalgia play is performance? He's got a notebook and a coffee can of names. I've got a fleet and a name you've printed on trucks for 2 decades. I let the words pass. Then I opened the folder and slid out a single page I hadn't planned to show unless he made it necessary. A simple chart of the last 6 months' service metrics on 2 rural routes, response times, repeat calls, completion rates pulled from public maintenance logs that anyone with patience could compile. I'd highlighted the weeks when Eddie's new managers had shuffled crews. Those are your numbers, I said to the room. You had better months when you were smaller and meaner. You can go back to that, or you can let me take the part that still works and keep it working. Silence. Not for long, just long enough for everyone to count the seconds and agree privately about what they'd just felt. The county attorney capped his pen. Mr. Price, if this proceeds, you'll assume obligations on existing work orders and inventory. You'll indemnify for anything you bolt on from day one. You'll accept liquidated damages if you miss response times 2 cycles in a row. I nodded. Yes to all 3. Put reasonable caps on the damages. I'm not insuring a blizzard. And you'll give me access to the bays for 48 hours ahead of assignment to prep the trucks. No banners, no press, just doors open and lights on. Whitford ticked his pad with a thumbnail. Our client would require a stalking horse agreement with a breakup fee if overbid. You're not running an auction, I said evenly. You're triaging a limb, but I'll live with a modest fee if someone wants to overpay for problems. We don't overpay for anything, Eddie said, the bite back in his voice. We fix them and send a bill. Send the bill. Send the bill, Lila's boss said dryly, to a checkbook that clears. No one smiled. That wasn't the room we were in. It took another 40 minutes to grind through specifics that people outside never imagine. VIN lists, lien releases, who owned the toolboxes men had paid for by the hour. At one point the county attorney asked about wage scale. Market +5, I said. And health care on day 1 for anyone who's been in a bay longer than a year. You can't buy loyalty, but you can stop selling it off in pieces. He made a small note. If it surprised him, he didn't say. When we reached the part about timeline, Whitford glanced at the clock. My client will make a decision by close of business tomorrow, he said. If Mr. Price is selected, we'll circulate documents overnight and expect signatures next day. Mr. Cole, absent a fully funded cure, we will move accordingly. Eddie sat back, the old showman working at the edges of his mouth, trying to assemble a smile from pieces that didn't fit. You take his number, he said to Whitford, and you'll devalue 10 years of contracts. He'll strip the work down to bolts and dignity, and you'll never get your brand premium back. I stood, not fast, just enough to end a sentence he wanted to keep speaking. I'm not buying your brand, I said. I'm buying alarms at 3 a.m. and trucks that start in January. The men who answer those alarms don't care what you call it if the parts arrive and the pay lands on Friday. Whitford closed his pad. "We're done for today," he said. "We'll be in touch." In the hallway, carpet muffled everything. Lila's boss held the door for me. "That wage line," he said under his breath. "You serious?" "Every dollar," I said. "You don't get reliability by asking a man to squeeze his own groceries." He nodded once, satisfied with the kind of answer you can explain to a board and a conscience. I stepped out into a noon that hadn't warmed at all. The light was thin and flat, like the town had been wiped with a cold cloth. Across the street, a coffee cart was doing slow business, construction guys blowing into their cups, a nurse in scrubs with a coat too light for the day. I took the long way to my truck and let the noise of the street rinse the room from my ears. Back home, I set the folder on the table and didn't touch it. I made a sandwich I couldn't taste and stood at the window until the glass fogged with my breath. The phone stayed still for an hour, then 2. At 3:10 it rang. The display said Haviland and Marks. "Mr. Price," Whitford said, voice as even as the carpet had been, "our client is prepared to proceed with your indication as a basis for an assignment. Documents will arrive by courier at 5. Please have your counsel review. We'll need wet signatures in the morning. The municipality will convene at 8 to approve. You'll have keys at 10, lifts at noon, routes at dawn on Friday." I looked at the clock, looked at the table, looked at the empty chair opposite mine, the one Martha used to pull out with her foot when she sat down with a list and a pencil. "Understood," I said. After we hung up, I called Joe. "This is the rope," I said. "Don't let go until you feel both hands on it." He didn't cheer. He didn't even say thanks. He said what men who've chased parts at midnight say when relief finally walks in the door. "Where do you want me first?" "Bay 3, I said. "Then the trucks. We start with the tools, not the speeches." Outside, the afternoon thinned into that blue hour winter saves for people who have earned it. Somewhere, Eddie would be standing in a different room with a different smell, trying to fit his old smile over new words. I didn't hate him. I didn't need to. Some outcomes are just gravity with paperwork. At 5:12, a courier in a windbreaker knocked twice. I signed for a thick envelope and laid it next to the letter from Caroline. 2 corners of 2 different lives meeting on my kitchen table under the same lamp. I sharpened a pencil. Then I began to read. The morning air had that tight, metallic bite that told you the cold wasn't just on the surface. It had settled deep into the steel of every hinge and handle in town. The courthouse clock struck 8 as I turned onto the municipal lot. The place was mostly quiet, just a scattering of sedans. A snowplow parked off to the side like it had been caught mid-stride, and the pale vapor of exhaust from the county's maintenance bay. By 8:15, I was in a small meeting room on the 2nd floor, across from 3 members of the municipal board. The county attorney was there too, flipping pages of the assignment documents, pointing to places for signatures. I'd reviewed them twice the night before, so there were no surprises. My pen moved slowly but without hesitation, each signature a nail in the coffin of Eddie's control. At 10 on the dot, Lila's boss walked in with a ring of keys, heavy, mismatched, each with a worn paper tag tied on with string. Bay access, shop floor, storage cages, admin office, side gate, he said, dropping them into my palm. The cold metal felt like more than just hardware. It was transfer of power, tangible and unpretentious. We walked across the lot together, boots crunching in the salt and grit. The side gate groaned open, its hinges resisting like an old dog wary of a new owner. Inside, the bays smelled of diesel and metal filings, the kind of honest, abrasive scent that clung to you for hours. A few mechanics were already there, leaning on tool carts or standing with arms crossed. They looked up when we came in, some with cautious interest, others with the flat expression of men who've seen management change before and know better than to commit too soon. "Morning," I said, voice carrying enough to fill the concrete space without barking. "I'm here to make sure these trucks roll on time, and you've got what you need to keep them that way. If you do your job, I'll do mine. Pay on Fridays, parts on shelves, and no gimmicks." There was a flicker then, not quite relief, but something leaning toward it. Joe stepped in from the far end, already in coveralls, a clipboard under his arm. "Bay 3's got the worst of it," he said. "Cylinders stripped, and there's a hydraulic line that looks like it's been patched twice. Get Sanderson's rep on the phone," I told him. "I want that part in by tomorrow morning. If he can't, we'll drive to pick it up ourselves." As we moved through each bay, I took mental notes: which lifts creaked, which tool chests were bare, where the floor drain needed clearing. In the storage cage, I found 3 unopened boxes of filters sitting behind a stack of scrap that should have been hauled away weeks ago. "We're going to start keeping inventory like it matters," I said to Castillo, who had followed me in. "You know what's here and what's missing better than anyone. I want a full list by the end of the day." Back on the shop floor, Eddie's shadow still lingered. His office door stood closed, a faint imprint of his name still visible where a placard had been unscrewed. I didn't touch it. The room would get cleaned when it needed to, not before. Around noon, the first delivery truck pulled up with replacement parts I'd ordered the night before. The driver glanced at the clipboard, then at me, and nodded like he already knew the change had gone through. Word travels fast in a small industry. By mid-afternoon, the place was louder, more alive. Air wrenches sang from 2 bays, a plow blade clanged as it was flipped for inspection, and the smell of welding drifted from the far corner. Men moved with purpose, even the ones who hadn't decided yet if they liked me, because the work was getting done and the parts were arriving. I stepped outside for a moment, standing by the gate. The sky was a dull pewter, the kind that promised more snow but held it back for later. From here I could see across the lot to where Eddie's truck was parked in his old reserved spot. It hadn't moved all day. When I went back inside, Joe was waiting with the first batch of maintenance reports in hand. "Bay 3's on track," he said. "Bay 6 needed a new compressor belt, already replaced. Fuel deliveries for the rural routes are confirmed for Thursday." He paused, lowering his voice. "Some of the guys say Eddie's been making calls trying to pull them back. So far, no bites." I nodded slowly. "He'll keep trying. Just make sure they've got a reason to stay here, not because they owe me, but because they can see the difference in the work." As the day wound down, I walked the bays one more time. The lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows across the concrete. It was the same shop Eddie had run, but it already felt different, less like a place waiting for the next problem, more like one getting ahead of it. When I locked up that night, the keys felt warmer in my hand. The kind of warmth that comes from use, not just possession. By midweek, the town had begun to do what towns always do when something shifts underneath them: listen harder. It wasn't a roar or a rumor mill cranked to full. It was the small, practical kind of listening, dispatchers checking response times twice instead of once. A foreman calling a friend at the county to ask who actually had the keys now. A clerk at the parts counter setting 2 invoices side by side and deciding which one got stamped first. None of it loud enough to cut air. All of it enough to move it. The first public mark came from the city, not the paper. A short item on the maintenance portal changed the vendor name on 2 routes from Coalworks Mobility to a plain line with my provisional company name, just a handful of letters and a number. The county assigns when they don't have time for ceremony. It sat there without fanfare for an hour before someone took a screenshot and sent it to a friend, and by afternoon the screenshot had been texted into half a dozen pockets and 3 group chats where men who fixed things decided whether they were about to have an easier winter. No statement from Eddie, no denial either, just a silence big enough to echo. At the bays, the week found its rhythm fast. On Tuesday morning, the first plough we'd serviced roared to life 10 minutes after the crew signed on, idled steady, and rolled into the lot on time. The driver, Pete, who'd been doing this since the county ran Ford tractors with bolted-on blades, stuck his head out the window as he passed Joe. "Feels like it wants to work," he said, and that was as good as a 5-star review in our line of trade. He didn't tweet it. He told the next driver in line, and that man told his supervisor when he signed the fuel chit, and by noon the word had traveled as far as it needed to. We turned 2 more trucks that morning, each with a little thing wrong that had become a big thing wrong because nobody with the authority to stop the clock had taken the time. A clogged inline filter, a cracked hose that leaked only when the weather sat at one cruel temperature, a cluster of connectors in a junction box that had been temporary for 8 months. I didn't give speeches about standards. I held the failed parts in my palm, let the men feel the difference between brittle and sound, and then wrote the part number on a clipboard that had a date beside it, not a slogan. In the afternoon, the county's deputy director came through in a coat too thin for the wind. He didn't bring a press aid. He walked the bays with Joe, asked 3 questions that told me he had read the contract and the calendar, and left with a small nod and a phone call I'm sure he completed before his car warmed. That night, the maintenance portal posted updated response times, nothing dramatic, just numbers that ticked in the right direction. The kind of improvement that looks small unless you've stood in the snow at 4 in the morning waiting on a truck that coughs instead of starts. Eddie made his first visible move on Wednesday, a letter to valued clients under Coalworks letterhead, copied to 3 council members, and for good measure, the editor of the county paper. We didn't get it directly. A copy found its way to our shop through a mechanic who had worked under him long enough to recognize when a tone doesn't match a tune. The letter said there had been a brief reassignment of certain mobility routes pursuant to lender guidance, that continuity of service remains our highest priority, and that Coalworks leadership remains in close consultation with county stakeholders. No lies in the strict sense, no truth you could set a wrench to. The paper ran a condensed version online that afternoon, headline so neutral it almost slid off the screen, and added a second paragraph sourced to county officials, noting that a successor vendor had already taken responsibility for a portion of the work. Comments were off again. I didn't miss them. What did come loud unexpectedly was a call from a church deacon I knew from the years when Martha and I still ran the winter coat drive. He managed the parish's ancient box truck, a rattletrap that groaned more than it rolled and hauled more kindness than any machine that age should be asked to bear. "Heard you were back at it, Walt," he said. "Ours won't pass inspection. Thought maybe you could look before we cancel the pickup for Saturday. We put the truck on the lift at 3 and had it legal by 6. The fix wasn't charity. It was attention, 2 exhaust clamps replaced, a misaligned brake cable bracket straightened, and a frame rust spot ground back and treated before it could bloom. The deacon's handshake at pickup was the quiet kind that lasts one beat longer than a neighbor's. The next morning, 2 more calls came in from small outfits. You don't put in press releases. The food pantry's van, the volunteer fire company's brush truck. When you keep those moving, the town notices even if no one writes it down, or maybe because no one writes it down. The men on the floor noticed something else. On Thursday, our first payroll hit. Market +5, like I'd said in the room with too much carpet. Healthcare enrollment packets stapled neatly with dates circled in pen. No confetti. No pep talk. Just envelopes on time. 2 mechanics from Eddie's shop called Joe that night to ask about options. He told them what I had told him to tell anyone. I don't poach. If you jump on paper for work that exists, and you'll know the name of the axle you'll be under on Monday. Late Thursday, I passed Eddie's building on my way home, more out of habit than interest. The lobby lights burned bright, but the offices above were dark except for one rectangle of yellow 2 floors up. I don't know if he was behind it. I do know that light looked like someone reading numbers that didn't fit together. Friday brought weather. Flurries by dawn, hard snow by noon, visibility down to the hood of your truck by 2. The kind of day that makes or breaks stories men tell about whether you're worth your salt. We'd staged for it. 1 swing unit fueled and ready, spares laid out on a rolling cart near each bay. Grit bins filled near the doors, so nobody went down hard on the floor with a part in his hand. When the county dispatcher called at 2:17 about a stalled plow on the East Ridge, diesel gelling, we had a warmed filter and a truck rolling in 9 minutes. Joe climbed out into a wind that knifed at open skin, swapped parts with the practiced calm he had when the clock got mean, and had the plow moving before the sun gave up. The dispatcher didn't clap. She lobbed the time. That's how you get remembered where it matters. That evening, after the last truck eased into the lot and the bays smelled like snow-wet steel and hot coolant, I stood in the doorway and watched the men peel off gloves and rub heat back into their hands. No one asked for a speech. I didn't give one. I just said, "Good work," the way my father had when a day's labor deserved acknowledgement and not ceremony. 2 of the younger techs grinned at each other like they'd been allowed to carry weight and had carried it. Later, alone in the office that still had a faint outline where Eddie's nameplate had been, I opened the mail. There was a letter from the lender's lawyers, a clean checklist of next steps and releases that would make the assignment complete, and a shorter note from the county attorney, reminding me of Monday's review where they'd formalize our arrangement in the minutes. 1 envelope, though, held handwriting. I knew at a glance, a tilt to the letters that used to show up on the outside of birthday cards and the inside of notes slid under a shop door when we'd locked it to make a delivery. It wasn't long. It didn't need to be. We were boys together, Walt. Don't let them write me out of my own house. No threat. Just an appeal to the one part of me that still understood him before he became the man in glass. I set it on the desk and stared at it until the hour made the words look like someone else's. Then I slid it into a drawer and locked it. That night the paper ran a photo above the fold, snow blowing sideways across Maine, a plow throwing an arc that looked almost theatrical. No caption named us. The credit under the image read only county staff photo. It was better that way. The work didn't need a signature. On Saturday morning, the curb outside Murphy's Diner was piled shoulder high with what the plows had pushed there, and men stepped like cranes between the piles to keep their socks dry. Doris topped off my mug without asking and tilted the paper open with 1 finger. "Looks like somebody remembered how to fix things," she said. "Town's full of somebodies," I said. "They just needed parts and permission." She made a sound that was half laugh, half agreement, and slid a second mug toward the empty seat across from me. "For whoever's next," she said. "Seems like you're going to be bringing people in again. Maybe I would. Maybe I'd keep the table to 1 cup for a while." Out the window, a Coalworks van rolled past slowly, driver's eyes forward, the logo on the door clean and a little lonelier than last week. A good name, even now. A name that would live on some places and come off others. I didn't taste victory. The word was too big for what this felt like. What I tasted was steadiness. The kind that lets a man lay down at night without his mind climbing back under a truck to jiggle what he already tightened. By afternoon the storm had moved east. The sun came out low and hard, catching anything with a corner and making it shine. I walked the bays once before locking up and found Joe on one knee beside a toolbox, wiping a socket set clean with an old t-shirt. "Feels different," he said without looking up. "It is," I said. "You hear anything from him?" he asked. "Enough," I said. "We'll hear more Monday when the county reads it into the record." He stood and closed the drawer with a solid click. "Some things you just want a clerk to say out loud. Some things," I said, "you just want to keep running." We shut off the lights 1 row at a time, the way I had since the days when the switch was a breaker on a plywood panel and you had to slap it with your palm. Out in the lot, the snow crunched under our boots with that fresh, clean sound that never gets old. The air was sharp, but it didn't bite. It woke. On the way home I drove past the river pull-off where we used to park the first van when money for fuel ran tight. The water slid black and silent under a lace of ice along the banks, and the sky was the color of a good wrench left out in the weather too long. I pulled in and let the engine idle. Across the dark I could see the town holding together the way small places do when people say less and do more. Hairline fractures had become lines, the kind of lines you can follow from a crack to a break if you don't stop and fix them. I wasn't fixing Eddie. That was never my job. I was fixing what men depended on at 4 in the morning after a storm. That was enough. And it was more than I'd had in a long time. Monday morning came with a light frost, the kind that turned windshields into rippled glass and made every step on the courthouse steps feel deliberate. I'd been in that building 100 times over the years, for contracts, for supply bids, once to sit in the back of a budget hearing just to see if my name got mentioned. But walking in with the county attorney at my side, file folder under my arm, and the keys to the bays in my pocket felt different. Not heavier, just final. The meeting room was the same as it had been for decades, polished oak dais, county seal hanging crooked above the chair in the center, rows of stiff-backed chairs that encouraged short speeches, a podium with a microphone that squealed if you leaned too close, fluorescent light that hummed softly over every pause in conversation. The clerk was already at her desk, sorting through the thick stack of agendas. She nodded when she saw me, that small-town kind of nod that says both I know exactly why you're here and I'm going to treat you the same as always. I liked her for that. Eddie was there before me, sitting 2 rows back from the dais, one leg crossed over the other, his foot tapping in that controlled rhythm he used to have when we were waiting on a deal to close. He'd dressed for the part, dark jacket, clean shirt, tie knotted just a bit too tight, but there was something about the way his shoulders sat that told me he wasn't sleeping well. He didn't look at me directly, but I could feel the edge of his attention every time I moved. The meeting started with the usual business, minutes from the last session, a zoning variance for a new storage facility, a contract renewal for the county's landscaping work. Then the chair cleared her throat and moved to the agenda item that mattered. Item 7B, she said, reading from the paper in front of her. Assignment of Municipal Snow and Mobility Service Contract from Coalworks Mobility, LLC to Ridgeview Fleet and Maintenance, LLC. Her voice was neutral, but she glanced toward me, then toward the county attorney, as if to confirm the paperwork was all in order. The attorney stood, adjusted his glasses, and gave the briefest of summaries. Due diligence completed, all obligations met, lender approvals on file. This assignment will ensure continuity of service during the winter season, he said, and provides for the retention of qualified personnel under the new management. The chair nodded. Any comments from the board? One of the senior members leaned into his microphone. I've had 3 calls this week from rural route supervisors. Trucks are running on time. Whatever you're doing, keep it up. His eyes flicked toward me, and for a moment the room felt warmer. Eddie shifted in his seat. I could hear the faint creak of the chair under him. He raised his hand. "Madam Chair," he began, his voice steady, but carrying that undertone I knew too well. The one he used when he was trying to thread the needle between sounding reasonable and keeping his pride intact. Coalworks has been serving this county for over a decade. This reassignment is not a reflection of our capabilities, but rather a temporary financial realignment. I'd like the record to show that we remain committed to our clients and our community. It was a tidy little speech, the kind that leaves just enough unsaid to let a man imagine his own version of the truth. The chair let it hang for a moment before responding. "Noted," she said. Then she looked at the clerk. "Please read the resolution." The clerk's voice was clear, professional. Resolution 2411B. Be it resolved that effective immediately, the Municipal Snow and Mobility Service contract previously held by Coalworks Mobility, LLC shall be assigned in full to Ridgeview Fleet and Maintenance, LLC. All rights, obligations and responsibilities under said contract shall transfer to the assignee. This action is taken in accordance with lender guidance and county operational requirements, passed and approved this day by the County Board of Supervisors. The chair looked down the row. All in favor. A came the chorus, every voice except one. The lone nay came from a board member who had been close to Eddie for years, but even he didn't look at Eddie as he said it. The gavel came down with a single solid crack. Just like that. It was official. The clerk entered it into the minutes, her pen moving with the kind of care that made each word permanent. "Assignment recorded," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. I didn't look at Eddie right away. I thanked the board, shook the attorney's hand, and stepped toward the side of the room. When I finally turned toward him, he was already standing, jacket buttoned, lips pressed into a thin line. He gave me a nod, not friendly, not hostile, just acknowledging. Then he walked out, his shoes striking the tile in that same even rhythm he'd kept for years. Outside, the air was sharp enough to sting. I stood for a moment on the courthouse steps, watching his taillights disappear down Main Street. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like the closing of a book we'd both been in too long, but the next chapter that would be mine to write. The week after the county meeting moved at its own kind of speed, not quick, not sluggish, but with the steady inevitability of a winter thaw. Once that gavel came down, the paper trail began to ripple outward. New vendor names in official memos, updated work orders, revised payment schedules. Every one of those documents was a small nail sealing the lid on Eddie's hold. The first sign of the shift came on Wednesday morning when I walked into Murphy's Diner. The regulars were in their usual places, elbows on tables, steaming mugs in hand, but there was a subtle rearrangement. 2 men who had always sat at Eddie's corner booth were now tucked into a smaller table near the window. No one mentioned it outright, but when I passed, they gave me the polite nod you offer to someone you might be working with soon. Word travels faster in small towns than any radio signal, and this week it was traveling in whispers. The county crews were careful not to say too much, but I could feel the way eyes followed me when I stepped into a bay or out onto a plough route. Mechanics who had been cautious before were now walking over with questions about equipment specs, about the pay scale, about whether I planned to keep things the old way or change them. I told each one the same thing. If the old way worked, it stays. If it didn't, it goes. By Thursday, the calls started. A council member wanted to confirm the budget line for equipment repairs under my management. A school district asked if we could fit in their buses for winter maintenance before the deep freeze hit. These weren't dramatic victories, but they were the kind that mattered. The quiet, practical commitments that meant my company's name was being penciled into plans Eddie used to own. Eddie, for his part, wasn't disappearing. I spotted him twice that week. Once in the hardware store, leaning over the counter talking to the owner in low tones. The second time, parked outside the county yard in his truck, engine idling, watching the plows roll out. He didn't wave, didn't approach, just kept his eyes on the machinery like he was trying to memorize their movements. But what struck me more were the absences. The loyal contacts he'd relied on were starting to keep their distance. The bank manager, who used to golf with him, skipped their usual Saturday tea time. The parts supplier, who always gave him favorable payment terms, suddenly started quoting retail prices in emails. Even his own crew, the ones still working for him on the contracts he'd managed to keep, were heard asking around about how things were going over at Ridgeview. Friday brought the first tangible win for my side, and I didn't even have to chase it. The county transit department, impressed with how quickly we'd turned around the plough fleet, asked if I could take a look at their senior shuttle buses. They've been limping along for months, the director admitted. If you can get them in shape, we'll make it worth your while. We had 2 of them in the shop that afternoon, and by the next morning, both were running smoother than they had in years. When one of the drivers, a woman in her 60s who'd been behind that wheel for a decade, shook my hand, she said, "Feels like someone's finally paying attention." That was better than any headline. Eddie must have heard about it, because that evening, a friend told me he'd been at the bar, nursing a single drink for over an hour, saying almost nothing. Just staring at the wall-mounted TV, while the local news ran a short segment about improved service times for county operations. They didn't name me, they didn't need to. The truth was working its way into the town's bloodstream, and it didn't require my voice to spread. By Sunday, I could see the cracks widening. Eddie's swagger had thinned to something more brittle, and the few allies he still had were speaking to him with the careful tone you reserve for someone whose fortunes have shifted. My own footing, meanwhile, felt steadier with each day. The county crews had stopped referring to me as the new guy and started saying our guy. The difference was subtle, but it landed deep. The revenge wasn't in the paperwork or the meetings. It was in moments like watching a county driver pull out of the yard in a truck that started on the first try, in overhearing a mechanic telling another, "Yeah, Ridgeview's running things now, and it's better, and we were just getting started." By the time the thaw set in enough to make gutters chatter, the town had adjusted to the new shape of things. Dispatchers spoke our name without checking themselves. The county clerk no longer paused before typing the vendor field. Even the plough drivers, who are superstitious by trade, stopped tapping the dash before turning the key. Work arrived. We did it. And the wheels turned. That was the whole promise. On a bright, windless Thursday, the envelope Eddie had been holding off finally found him. It wasn't dramatic, no deputy with a badge, no courtroom scene, just a courier in a knit cap handing a packet across a glass desk. Inside was what every man recognizes, even if he's never had to read it. The end of a lease with no extension, a notice of auction for fixtures and furnishings, and a date 2 weeks out when whatever bore the coalworks name in that building would either belong to someone else or to nobody at all. I didn't hear it from him. I heard it from the sign crew. "Got you on the schedule for 9, the foreman said when he called the shop. His voice had the easy neutrality of a man who makes things go up and come down for a living. "We're removing the letters at the main office. Landlord wants them down before the walk-through. We'll need the side lot kept clear so we can swing the boom." "I don't control that lot," I said, though we both knew the difference between controlling and being listened to. "But I'll make some calls." At 8:50, the boom truck eased in, tires whispering over the slush, outriggers dropping with soft thuds that traveled into the soles of your boots. The letters hadn't looked heavy all these years, but steel and acrylic weigh more than the light they reflect. The foreman clipped on his harness and rode the basket up until he was eye level with the sea. He ran a gloved thumb along the top edge, like a barber checking the line of a cut. 2 of Eddie's office staff came out and stood near the door, coats open over clothes that didn't fit the weather. They watched without speaking, arms crossed to keep their hands from doing anything that would betray what they were feeling. After a minute, one of them went back inside. The other stayed. Eddie pulled in at 9:05 and parked where he always had, nose of the truck lined up with the same crack in the asphalt he'd used as a marker for years. He sat there for a moment, hands at 10 and 2, then got out and walked toward the entrance with his shoulders set at a height that looked practiced and tired at once. The foreman paused with the driver bit pressed into the seam behind the sea, waiting the way men do when they have a job and an audience. Eddie didn't tell him to stop. He just lifted a hand with 2 fingers raised, a small, precise hold. The foreman nodded, rested his elbow on the basket rail, and looked down at Eddie the way a man looks at someone whose name he has heard more than he has spoken. "Give me 5, Eddie said, not loud, not begging. A request for grace that meant nothing on paper and costs real men nothing to grant. I had no reason to be there beyond the knowledge that some chapters deserve witnesses. I stood across the street, near the maple that drops brown helicopter seeds every spring. Joe eased up beside me in a truck, still wearing road salt down its flanks. Neither of us spoke. Eddie went inside and re-emerged with a banker's box. He set it on the hood of his truck and opened it, then closed it again as if he'd remembered you can't sort 30 years on the sidewalk. He slid the box into the cab, came back, and stood directly below the sea. "Okay," he said, looking up. The driver bit whined. Screws that had outlasted 2 recessions turned a quarter, then a half, then let go with small squeaks. The sea came off cleaner than anyone expected, without ripping the membrane of sealant beneath it. The foreman tipped it carefully and lowered it by hand to the man on the slate below, who set it against the wall where it looked large and lonely. The O followed, then the L, the E. 4 letters disassembled into their parts. The W took longer. The center brace had been over-torqued by someone in a hurry, years back, and the screws chewed their own heads before admitting defeat. The foreman swapped bits, changed his angle, and took his time. Things mounted badly require patience to remove. He worked each fastener until it remembered what it was supposed to be. Through the glass, you could see into the lobby, the awards case empty, the outline of rectangles on the wall where plaques had hung, the faint sun fade of a slogan that had once read "Hustle honestly" and now read "Hus on" because vinyl forgets differently than paint. A plant drooped in the corner with the kind of thirst no one fixes in the last week of a tenancy. When the last S came down and leaned against its brothers, Eddie stepped forward and placed his palm flat against the brick where the ghost of the letter still showed. It wasn't a cinematic gesture, it was the instinct of a man feeling for a pulse he knows he won't find. He kept it there a breath, maybe two, then dropped his hand and let his fingers brush the mortar, as if to take some proof of texture with him. The foreman rode the basket down and unclipped with a practiced swivel. He signed a form on the clipboard, tore off the top sheet, and handed it to Eddie. "We'll store 'em for 30, he said, "and then they're scrap." Eddie folded the paper once and slid it into his jacket pocket. He looked over at me across the street and gave a nod. Not a challenge, not a truce. A simple acknowledgement from one man to another who had both held weight on the same beam and now held different ends of it. I nodded back. Joe exhaled through his nose. "That it?" he asked. "It's enough," I said. "There's still the paper to finish. But this is the part men see." We walked the long way back to the shop, past the river pull-off. The ice had broken in long articulate sheets that bumped one another and made a sound like plates being stacked in a kitchen. It was a pleasing domestic noise right there in the cold. Joe drummed the steering wheel with 2 fingers. "He wasn't a bad boss," he said quietly. "Just stopped being a good one." "That's where it starts," I said. "You keep the story and lose the work." Back at the base, the day asked nothing special. A plow needed a new cutting edge. 2 diesel heaters wanted patience before they would fire and stay lit. The shuttle bus that had run fine on Tuesday decided it would not on Thursday until Castillo listened with his head tilted and replaced a crank sensor that failed only when cold. We wrote times on the board and part numbers on a list, and without saying it out loud, recognized that the business of keeping things moving is the same on days when men watch letters come down and on days when no one watches at all. Late afternoon brought a visitor I hadn't expected. Lola's boss stepped into the shop without his coat, waving off the cold like it didn't get a vote. "Heard you had a quiet morning," he said. "Sign crew called for lane control." "We kept out of their way," I said. He nodded. "Board asked me to pass along appreciation. Response times are up. Complaints are down. Budgets are tracking. It's not complicated math, but you'd be amazed how many times folks turn it into a seminar. Seminars are warmer than bays," I said. He smiled. As he turned to go, he stopped. "There's talk," he said, picking his words as if they had edges, "of consolidating the remaining urban service under one vendor next fiscal. RFP will be clean. If you bid the way you work. Don't promise shiny." "I don't know how to promise shiny," I said. "That's why I came," he said, and left us to the sound of the air hose hissing at the quick connect and the ratchet singing 4 short notes and a long one. When the day wound down to the hour where the lights buzz a little louder and the concrete holds the heat it will give back later, I took a walk by myself to the far end of the lot. The sky had gone that polished nickel color that makes every edge look slightly truer than it does at noon. Across town, you could almost see the gap where the letters had been. A blank above a door, a space waiting for something truer or for nothing at all. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. A message from a number that belonged to nobody and everybody in a small place. A photo of the sign crew loading the last of the letters onto the truck, straps cinched, corners protected with cardboard so they wouldn't scar. Under it, 6 words, "Thought you might want to know." I looked at the picture and thought of the napkin we'd drawn on at Murphy's, the cheap pen bleeding a little into the paper, The way Eddie had traced my lines with his fingertip and said, "We can build this." We had. Just not together. There's a kind of mercy in admitting both halves of that sentence. I didn't answer the text. I put the phone away and listened to the shop closing up. Joe's steady voice telling a younger tech to label the bins properly. Castillo's laugh, the clank of a door rolled down and latched. In the office, the inbox pinged once with a vendor confirmation. I initialed the packing list and left it on the desk for morning. On my way home, I drove the route past the old building one more time. The wall where the letters had been looked older than the rest. Sun had done its quiet work, and now the ghost of the name showed in a paler brick. It would weather out if left alone, or someone would paint it. That wasn't my decision, and didn't need to be. I watched a man in a knit cap sweep rock salt from the entry mat, with brisk, efficient strokes, and thought, a place is still a place after a sign changes. At the light, a coalworks van idled in the next lane. The driver glanced over, recognized me, and gave that small nod men offer across distances they didn't choose. I returned it. The light turned, and the van pulled ahead, the logo catching a last shard of late sun and flaring bright before the angle took it away. Back at the house, I turned the key and stepped into warm air that smelled faintly of solvent from a rag I should have rinsed better and left out to dry. On the table, Martha's photo caught the same late light and did what it has always done, reminded me that the test isn't whether you win, it's whether you can look at what you've built and tell the truth about how you built it. Tomorrow there would be more trucks, more lists, more of the same small work that adds up to something a town can lean on. Eddie would wake in a house that was still his, and a town that was still ours, and he would have to do the one thing he hasn't done in a long time. Decide what his hands are for now. I rinsed the rag, hung it where it belonged, and let the furnace settle. Outside, the night set in without commentary. Inside, the quiet wasn't empty. It was earned. The first real snow after the takeover came late that year. It arrived overnight, muffling the streets and painting the roofs with the kind of powder that makes a town look smaller and cleaner than it is. By dawn, plows were already out, lights spinning in the half-dark, clearing routes the county had flagged in bright yellow on my desk map the day before. I walked the lot with my hands in my pockets, the kind of slow lap that lets you take stock without a clipboard. The trucks were running smoother now. We'd done the pre-season work right. Even the oldest rigs coughed once, then settled into a steady diesel rhythm that seemed to say, "We're good. Let's move." From the edge of the property, I could see the old coalworks yard across town. The fence was still there, but the gates were chained shut. A realtor's sign leaned slightly against the wind, half buried in drifted snow. A number to call, a future to be decided. Eddie hadn't fought the end publicly. No angry letters to the paper, no lawsuits, just a quiet retreat. Folks told me he still came into Murphy's some mornings, sitting in a smaller booth now, sipping coffee like it was a job he could still clock in for. Sometimes people joined him, more often they didn't. In the weeks since the letters came down, I'd seen him twice. The first time we passed each other in the aisle of the hardware store, he nodded and I nodded back. That was it. The second time, he pulled up beside me at a stoplight. For a moment, I thought he might roll down the window, but when the green came, he just drove on. I didn't feel the urge to follow. The county crews had found their rhythm under our management. Complaints were handled same day. Jobs were finished when we said they'd be. And for the first time in a long while, folks were stopping me on the street, not to ask for favors, but to say, "Good work." It wasn't loud praise, but it didn't need to be. In a small town, steady hands speak louder than headlines. One afternoon, Lila's boss stopped by again. He leaned against the bay door, watching the men swap out a plow blade. "You've made a difference," he said simply. "Not just in the work, in how folks feel about the work." It hit me then. This had started as payback, pure and sharp, aimed at the man who'd tried to push me out. But along the way, it had turned into something else. A restoration maybe, not just for me, but for the people depending on the work to be done right. Eddie had lost what he built. I had gained more than I expected, and in that quiet exchange, the balance was struck. That evening, I drove past the old yard one more time. The realtor's sign had fallen over completely now, lying flat in the snow. I didn't stop to pick it up. Some things you leave where they land. Back home, the house was warm. Martha's photo sat where it always had, catching the lamplight. I poured myself a coffee, sat at the table, and let the quiet settle. The road to here hadn't been straight, but it had brought me exactly where I was meant to be, with my name on the work, my hands in the doing, and my dignity intact. Sometimes revenge isn't a single strike. Sometimes it's the slow, steady reclaiming of what should never have been taken. And sometimes, when it's done right, it leaves you not just victorious, but at peace. The thaw held for a week. Then winter returned the way it always does in this part of the county, without apology, with a crisp edge that polished the air until it rang on the teeth. We were ready. The morning checklist had shortened, not because there was less to do, but because the men knew the sequence by heart: fuel, fluids, lights, hydraulic lines, plow bolts, salt augers. Someone new to the shop might have called it routine. We knew better. It was a kind of oath. Word from the board came down in 2 lines, and a signature: renewal for the remainder of the season, option for next year. Performance review noted as exceeds, no speeches. Just a stamp that said the town had decided we were, for now, the hands it trusted. That same afternoon, Joe came into the office with a towel slung over his shoulder and a smudge of graphite across the bridge of his nose. "Bay 3's singing," he said. "New cylinder took. No creep, no hiss. Feels like a fresh hinge." He said it the way a man delivers news of a small miracle. I looked past him through the office window at the trucks, lined like cattle in a chute, and thought, this is what we traded for all those years ago when we were boys, with a napkin and a belief. Not a name over a door. The work under it. I hadn't seen Eddie in almost a month. The realtor's sign at his old building had been replaced with a new one that promised light industrial creative flex to people who liked their past repainted. The letters that once spelled his name sat, I imagined, in a warehouse somewhere between obsolete and available upon inquiry. If he drove past our lot, he did it at hours I wasn't looking. The day he did find me, it was at Murphy's, because of course it was. The bell on the door gave its tired ring, and he stood there a second longer than you're supposed to, eyes adjusting from winter glare to diner light. Doris poured a coffee without being asked and set it at the far end. He took the seat, one of the small tables where elbows touch if 2 men lean in at once, and stared at the steam like it had something to tell him. I left my booth and crossed the linoleum that still had the same crack near the back register it had when we were counting nickels for pie. He looked up, wary, ready to square old accounts or defend new silences. I pulled the chair out and sat, palms on the table, the way a foreman does when he's about to explain a change in the schedule. "I'm not here to gloat," I said. "There isn't anything in this that gloats well." He nodded slowly. Some endings don't have a proper shape, he said. They just stop. He thumbed the rim of the cup, an old fidget. I keep meaning to hate you for it, he added, almost curious. Can't make it stick. I don't hate you, I said. I hated who you let yourself become. He winced at that, small, honest. That's fair, he said after a breath. You always were better at the nouns. We sat with our coffees. The diner moved around us the way it always has, pump pots hissing, forks clicking, a short order bell shouting once, and then forgetting what it had to say. After a minute he reached inside his coat and set a folded grease-stained square on the table between us. Paper gone soft with years. Lines faded to the brown of tea. I found it when I cleared the last drawer, he said. Thought you might want the piece that started the fight. The napkin, the roots, the van layout. The little arrow I'd drawn showing where to store the belts so a man wouldn't have to cross the bay twice and lose his place in the sequence. I touched the paper with one finger. The fibers gave a little, like old cotton. For a wild second I considered handing it back, making him keep the proof of what we were before we decided otherwise. Then I slipped it gently into my inside pocket. I'll frame it in the office, I said. Not the front, the bay where the men can see it when it matters. He smiled at that, a clean line, unarmed. You'll keep the work honest, he said. We were good at that before I got interested in how stories sound. I didn't tell him stories had saved us too, in small ways. The story the men told each other about how parts would be on the shelf. The story the county told itself about plows that start on the first try. The story a town learns again about how some things happen on time because someone made sure of it. Not all stories are vanity. When I stood to go, he didn't follow. He lifted his cup in a little salute, and I answered in kind. We had no more threats to trade, no more promises to break. Just two men with winter to get through. One with a sign he no longer owned, one with a map he finally did. Back at the shop, Joe had three young techs gathered around a bench vise, a crank sensor clamped soft in the jaws. He was telling them how to listen with their fingertips, how a part speaks before it fails, if you get quiet enough to hear it. They leaned in like apprentices have forever, chasing the trick that is not a trick at all, attention shaped into skill. End of month Friday, I called across the room. Checks at 3. If anyone's got a payroll question, bring it before noon so we can fix it without drama. There was a little cheer from the far bay. Not noisy, just pleased. Envelopes on time do something to a room that no poster ever will. I signed the last of the vendor releases, stuck a note to the whiteboard about road salt deliveries, and walked out to the lot. The sky had split open in that rare winter way, high, clean blue sun sharp enough to draw shadows off anything that stuck even an inch above the snow. The plows looked handsomer than steel has a right to. A good tool under good light can do that to a man. Mid-afternoon, Lila dropped by with a file and the raised eyebrow she uses when the county wants to say thank you but refuses to learn how. Board wants to pretend this is a compliance check, she said, handing me a one-page sheet with 4 boxes and 3 already ticked. It's a way to hear you say out loud what you're already doing. I can say it in fewer words than they want, I said. They'll forgive you, she said. The truck started last storm. Forgiveness is cheaper than tow bills. When she left, a small group from the volunteer fire company rolled in behind their brush truck, exhaust hanging in the air in heavy ropes. Got a cough we can't shake, their captain said. We took it on a lift. Castillo listened. Joe chalked the timing mark. Iverson slid under with a light and a rag. 20 minutes later, The cough was gone and the captain shook my hand with both of his like he was saving fire for later. Those are the moments that clip themselves to your ribs. Toward closing, I opened the office drawer where I'd kept the letter Eddie wrote, the one asking not to be written out of his own house. I read it once more in the late light, then slid it into a new envelope, along with a photocopy of the napkin. The ink outlines darkened just enough to be legible. On the flap I printed his address in square, careful letters. There are histories you don't erase, only file correctly. He had been there, so had I. The town, stubborn and forgiving as it is, would keep both facts in the big ledger it maintains silently about all of us. That night, a town councilman I've known since we both had more hair stopped by the bays with his grandson. The boy's eyes were round as hammers. He wanted to see where the plows sleep. The man said, "Says they sound like dragons." We gave the kid ear protection and let him watch Joe bump a truck to life for a diagnostic. The boy clapped his gloved hands at the rumble. On their way out he asked his grandfather if the trucks ever get scared. "Only when we forget to take care of them," the old man said, and I nearly laughed out loud from the truth of it. I locked the gate at 7, the key turning with that satisfying bite it has when tumblers remember their job. The cold had sharpened again, breath fogged in front of my mouth, and drifted away like thoughts you no longer need. On the way home I swung past the river pull-off and let the truck idle. Ice plates clicked and nudged in the dark, each finding its place until the whole curve of the bend hummed in low agreement. That sound will carry a man a long way if he lets it. At the house I set the napkin on the kitchen table and smoothed it under the lamplight. The lines were crude, the idea was not. I took a frame from the hall closet, Martha's favorite oak with a nick on the lower left, and slid the paper inside. In the morning I would hang it in the bay office where it belonged, at eye level, next to the whiteboard where part numbers live and jokes die. The men would see it or not. Either way, it would be where the work could look over and nod. I stood a minute longer beneath the kitchen clock, listening to the furnace breathe, to the quiet, to the small steady beat a good day leaves behind when you've done your part and the rest of the town is doing theirs. Then, because I am an old man who has learned what to do with both history and heat, I turned the thermostat up 1 degree, not for triumph, not for symbolism, just because the night had earned a little more warmth. Outside, the streetlights wore their halos. Inside, the house held its own. We had not rebuilt the past. We had kept what was worth keeping and laid the rest down gently. That was enough. It is most days the only honest thing a man can promise. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from. I'd love to know.